So Brian will enjoy this. The shell crashed in the middle of all that, but also made a wonderful recovery. So hi, I'm Pieter Kasselman. I'm a SPIFFE enthusiast. I'm with Microsoft, and it also turns out that I used to work for Ryan when he was at Microsoft. So sort of really quite the honor to be following Ryan after that talk. So I'm going to talk a little bit about connecting identity ecosystems. And let's see if I can get this to advance. Here we go. So the next 10 minutes, and I promise I'll be as brief as possible, I'm going to talk a little bit about first this sort of Cambrian explosion of workloads and why we need standards to manage them, right? Both in terms of the scale and the diversity of what's happening right now. There's also some good news here, but there's also a few gaps, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And then we also have ways to bring it all together. And this is really this idea of how do we think about connecting our different ecosystems so that our customers don't have to. So our workload Cambrian explosion. So I think one of the things that is happening is there's an absolute exponential growth in the number of things that are doing compute, right? We have the numbers. Every time I see them, there's even more of them, but it's growing at a sort of 2 or 3 orders of magnitude, way faster than anything that we see in the user identity space, right? So we're sort of going from a ratio of maybe 1 to 5 to 1 to 20 to 1 to 40 in the next 3 to 5 years. So really rapid growth. The other thing that we're seeing is this emergence of multi-cloud, multi-hybrid. Something like 84% of our customers now are operating in multi-cloud environments, sometimes by design, sometimes by accident. But they all have this one challenge now. They need to manage all these different workloads that they're running, make sure that they're all connected to one another, and they have to do this in this multi-cloud environment. And they're in this heterogeneous solution space, right? You're running on 2, 3 different clouds. Guess what? You're going to need 2 or 3 different sets of expertise to deal with identity concepts alone, right? And so this is getting really challenging, especially in the world of what I think of as expertise elsewhere. And Brian mentioned it as well, right? We want engineers to be working on the most important business problems that we have. And that's what their expertise is. They're not identity experts, right? And so expecting them to become identity experts just so that they can do their jobs, that is not a great thing for us to go do. And then the last one is security. So when you start looking at this whole idea of zero trust architecture or least privilege access, what that really comes down to is, can you constrain the access that your individual workloads have so that they only have access to the right things at the right time for the right reason? But to do that, you actually need to know where your workloads are, and you need to be able to reason over them. You need to be able to deploy policy, and then you actually need to be able to govern, right? So you need to be able to look at the access, you need to look at the audit logs, you need to be able to figure out things like risk profiles and remedial steps. And doing all of this at scale, right? These things are all happening at the same time. And this is actually a problem that is made for standards, right? Standards sort of help with all of these things. It scales your expertise, it gives you better security promises, it helps you unify those heterogeneous environments, and it helps you deal with growth, right? It's a way to succeed at scale. So we need standards, but we don't need just one standard. We need many standards. We need standards for identifiers, credential formats, attestation, secrets management, provisioning, authentication, authorization, and so on, right? And the good news is SPIFFE actually does solve a huge bit of this, right? So there is some really good news. We already have a lot of standards. They're spread over many standards bodies and many working groups within those standards bodies. But we're actually in far better shape than we could have been. And there are even new things appearing that may not quite be standards, but they're quite interesting, right? Things like this new Cedar policy language, and so on. And rather than going through all of this, right, I think, so the good news, we have lots of standards that we can choose from. And SPIFFE, as you can see, is really neat, right? It solves problems with identifiers, credential formats, gives us concepts around attestation with Spire, provisioning, and then it has concepts around federation. And it really sets you up well to do some of the authentication and authorization pieces. But mind the gap, right? So one of the things that we're observing is that as you start trying to build a system, once you start working at the system level, there are gaps that are appearing between these ecosystems. And to illustrate it, right, for example, so when you try to go end-to-end, you may have a resource owner in OAuth speak, we also known as a human, who's trying to access a service. They're using a client, and they end up authorizing to the server via the client, and that gets presented to what is known as the resource server, right? That's OAuth 2.0. But unfortunately, right, the resource server actually turns out to be many services. And the requests get passed from one place to another, and we start losing user context. There's a bunch of bearer tokens in there. I share Ryan's general dislike of bearer tokens. They've been causing us lots and lots of problems. And this is kind of where SPIFFE helps, right? And so there's this overlap, right? So there's the OAuth world and the SPIFFE world. And these are just sort of two examples of this. But it doesn't end there, of course, right? Because before you know it, you're calling into yet another cloud service, which may not be based on SPIFFE necessarily. Maybe it's some different system, or maybe it is a SPIFFE-based system. But essentially, this problem sort of, the deeper you go, the more you try and sort of figure out all the things that you want to do end-to-end, and you think about all the security promises that you would like to make, these gaps between the standards start showing up, right? So questions like user context, right? How does that very last microservice in the call chain, how do we make sure that the identity of that resource owner that entered hasn't been replayed, hasn't been, so nobody's spoofing that identity, right? How do we preserve all that context? Evan talked a little bit earlier about this idea of generating proofs that we can bind to requests. So how do we do that, right? How do we create request binding so that, again, the sort of replay or the exfiltration or loss of something like a JOT, SVJOT, doesn't necessarily become some kind of problem in the future, right? Can we actually do some form of binding there? Client registration is actually a very interesting challenge. So in the OAuth universe, we are always registering a client very explicitly. But in the workload identity space, those clients, they come and they go. And even though there are things like dynamic client registration, that doesn't always work very well at scale because you're constantly pinging back to some sort of centralized server. And so the question is, right, how should we think about that from the OAuth perspective, right? How do we rethink things around client registration? Then there's resiliency and latency that becomes a consideration. And it's actually one of the things that's really attractive about SPIFFE is it actually gives us ways to have low latency and much more resilient services. And then we get to authorization, right? Because it turns out having identity is useful, but you really want to use that identity for something. You need to authenticate, and that's a good start. But then you have to make an authorization decision, right? And so there's this next layer that we need around everything to figure out what's the right way to do authorization. And then finally, it really very often comes back to this from a business perspective, some form of audit, some sort of compliance, some way, some mechanism to govern and reason over the systems that we deploy. And today, although there are many standards that help with each of these things, when you try and build the system, there's some gaps there that start appearing. So what do we need to do? How do we connect these ecosystems? And there's a couple of icons there that some of the identity or places where we engage in identity standards. And so one of the things that we're doing and that we're launching is this, there's this new mailing list, the Workload Identity and Multi-Service Environments, or WIMSE. It's a new IETF mailing list where people have been sharing use cases, some new proposals, things like token buckets. I just saw a draft appear that is recommending some best current practices for workload identity. And this idea of how do we take some of the best of Depop and turn that into request binding, right? These are the kind of discussions that's beginning to emerge there. We're in the early stages of a draft charter proposal. So, and really, we think we need a working group potentially here, and we'll see if there's enough support in the community. And perhaps there are folks here who are interested in joining us in that journey to come and support the creation of a working group that will help define best practices for some of these key scenarios that we're identifying. If there are gaps, right, can we figure out where we should go plug those gaps? In which working groups, in which standards bodies do we need to go do work? And then finally, also doing some standards work within the working group itself, especially if we don't find any other good places for it to fit. So, if you're interested in this space, if you have a passion for standards and you have a passion for solving this problem and making all of these standards play well together, please join the conversation. You can scan that QR code if you're brave enough. So I'm also the editor for a spec or a best current practice called cross-device security. And the reason how to put it, one of the things that I've become very skeptical about is scanning QR codes, but I'll put it up anyway for folks just in case they feel brave. So yes, I think that's it. I would love, if there's any questions, I'm happy to take them. And again, if you're interested in this space, if you want to help make progress and help connect these different ecosystems, we'd love to have your participation in the WIMSE working group or in the WIMSE mailing list.
I think we can take one or two questions, and then we'll pass it over to the next presenter.
I have one. Thank you very much, Pieter, for presenting. If I want to participate in this group and contribute, what's the best way to? I see join the conversation, but how should I think about engaging with you all?
It's very simple. I think sign up to the mailing list, and all the business really gets done on the mailing list. So you'd have an opportunity the business gets done on the mailing list. We will also have a birds of a feather session at the next meeting at the IETF in Prague. So if you're in Europe and you're in and around the Prague environments, the second week of November, I haven't seen the schedule or a date yet, but we do have a birds of a feather session that week, and that'll also get announced on the WIMSE mailing list. So if folks are around and you want to drop in or come and participate in person, that would be fantastic as well.
Awesome, thank you. Anything else?
No, I think that's it. So,
all right. Well, thanks everyone.
Dan, are you on?